Have you ever wondered what another photographer meant when they mentioned something called back button focusing? Well, today we're going to talk about what it means and how to use it. Welcome to the Visual Center. I'm Trent. In this video, we'll be continuing our discussion regarding focusing. Specifically in today's video, different techniques to activate and utilize our camera's autofocus. I'm certain many of you already know, and I can remember mentioning it in my previous video, that in order to activate autofocus on our cameras, we need to press the shutter release button, this big button here, halfway down. So the shutter release button is dual purpose. Actually, it serves about 4 different purposes. 1, it can wake up the camera from standby mode. 2nd, it can activate exposure metering. 3rd, it can activate our autofocus. And 4th, it will release the shutter or fire the camera. Now, regarding autofocus activation, when we press the shutter release button halfway down, we should feel a bit of resistance. This is to help prevent us from releasing the shutter or taking a photo inadvertently. Now, if we press further, our camera will fire just like that. Now, this technique is the most widely used autofocus activation technique, and I believe that this is the case because it's the most obvious technique. You want to take a picture? Well, press this big button, it focuses, and it fires the camera. It's that simple. Now, depending on the camera, there may also be other techniques to activate focus. Another method is often referred to as back button focusing. So, what is back button focusing? Certain cameras have a button at the back of the camera, hence the term back button. Often this button is located near the viewfinder or the natural resting place for the thumb, like this one here. Now, this button will activate and or lock the camera's autofocus. Now, using this rear button as an alternative way to activate autofocus may help if you find yourself accidentally firing your camera before autofocus has the time to activate. So if you're having trouble using the shutter release button as the autofocus control, use this back button. Now, look for these symbols on your camera. These are most likely the buttons you'll use for back button focusing. Now, some cameras may have 1 button, some may have 2. You can use the camera settings to select and change the control of these rear buttons. Now let me explain the technique. Probably the most common back button focusing technique is used by turning off the autofocus activation from the shutter release button. So if I made that change, when I press down on my shutter release button, autofocus will no longer activate. Nothing will happen with my focus. I will need to press the rear button to activate my autofocus. This back button will function in the exact same way as the shutter release button did when I'm taking autofocus. It will recognize the focusing mode you have selected. So we discussed focusing modes in my previous video. Now, one thing you do need to remember that once you set up this process of focusing, your shutter release button will no longer activate autofocus. So there can be a bit of a learning curve with this new technique. Now, there's also an additional back button focusing technique which I really enjoy using. Instead of removing autofocus from the shutter release button, just leave it the way it is. Change the focusing mode to continuous focusing mode, AFC or AI servo, then set the back button as a focusing lock button. When you press the shutter release button down halfway, autofocus will continuously update, which is good for moving subjects. Then, once you press and hold the back button, your focus will freeze and hold its current position. You can shoot repeated images without updating the focus. And once we let go of the rear button, autofocus will restart. Now, why would we want to use either of these techniques? These techniques can be very helpful, especially when shooting moving subject matter. If we're shooting weddings, sports, or wildlife, the subject matter is very likely to move, but also has moments of stillness. Back button focusing will help us change from continuous focusing mode for when the subject is moving to a single focusing mode for when the subject is still. Now, another reason to use these focusing methods is during a technique called focus and recompose. If we're creating an image and initially point our camera straight at the subject and activate the autofocus, we can then press the rear button to lock in that autofocus. Now we can recompose the image and shoot as many frames as we need without reactivating the autofocus, thus keeping the original subject in focus. Now, this technique can also save a bit of time. If our subject isn't changing distance from the camera, then there's no need to refocus. Use the back button to lock in focus and prevent wasted time refocusing. Now, this is what the technique looks like through the camera. Okay, I'm going to be shooting some of these analog SLRs on a shelf in my office here. I'm going to begin first by changing my focusing mode from AFS to AFC, or continuous autofocus. Now I'm going to go to my menu, and I'm going to go down to my custom setting menu, and then down to F, controls. I'm going to select a custom control assignment, and then I'm going to go to the AF on button. Now it's already set to AF lock, so I'm going to keep it on AF lock. Now I'm going to obtain focus on this Canon SLR, and I'm going to move the camera. And you can see with just the autofocus on from my shutter release button, the autofocus continues to update as I move the camera. Now I'm going to depress the autofocus lock button on the back. And so now, as you see as I move the camera, the autofocus doesn't update no matter where I move it. The autofocus maintains from that original point because I have that button, the rear button, pressed. I'm going to update focus again on this camera and move around. And you can see I can recompose, and the camera I focused on originally is still in focus. Now, I would recommend experimenting with these techniques. You may find advantages to both, and depending on your camera, you may be able to set up a custom preset which will provide you with an efficient method of switching between the two. If you need help figuring out how to change the settings on your camera, let us know in the comments below. Or you can take a look at your camera's user manual. You should be able to find instructions on how to change the focusing settings on your camera. If you have any questions regarding these techniques or have some experiences you would like to share with us, please let us know in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. Be sure to subscribe so you won't miss out on my future videos as we continue to discuss focusing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Carlos isn't the only one that can grow a beard. Oh yeah.